Henry Clay Frick sat in his office chair, bleeding from the neck, and finished the workday. That is not a metaphor. That is what happened on July 23, 1892, in the offices of Carnegie Steel in Pittsburgh. An anarchist named Alexander Berkman walked in off the street, put 2 bullets into Frick, and drove a knife between his ribs 3 separate times. Frick had the man subdued, refused to be carried out on a stretcher, dictated a statement to the press, signed several documents requiring his immediate attention, and then, only then, allowed a doctor to remove the bullets. Nobody was particularly surprised, because by 1892, the entire American labor movement already knew what Henry Clay Frick was. He was the man who had turned coal into a weapon, the man who had built a coke empire on the broken bodies of immigrant workers and then defended it with armed mercenaries, barbed wire, and a contempt for human life that was so complete, so systematic, so efficiently organized that it shocked even the other robber barons. Let those numbers land. By the age of 30, Frick personally controlled 80% of all the coke production in the Connellsville region of Pennsylvania, the fuel supply that powered the entire American steel industry. By 40, he was Andrew Carnegie's partner and the operational brain behind the largest steel corporation on earth. By the time he was 50, his personal fortune exceeded what would be $600 million today. But the number that defines Henry Clay Frick is not a money figure. It is this. During the Homestead Strike of 1892, Frick deployed 300 armed Pinkerton agents against his own workers, men, women, and children, on the banks of the Monongahela River. 9 workers died, 7 Pinkertons died, and Frick, bleeding from an assassin's bullets 2 weeks later, told a reporter, "I will not compromise." He never did, not once, not about anything. This is the story of Henry Clay Frick, the coke king who weaponized coal, crushed the American labor movement at its most critical moment, and built one of the most exquisite art collections in the world with money earned in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. To understand what Henry Clay Frick built and what he destroyed, you need to understand what Pennsylvania coal was in the years after the Civil War. The Connellsville seam ran for 50 miles through the hills of southwestern Pennsylvania. It was not ordinary coal, it was coking coal, a specific geological variety with an unusually low sulfur content and an unusually high carbon concentration that, when baked in an oven at extreme temperatures, produced coke, the dense, porous, near-pure carbon fuel that iron blast furnaces required to smelt ore into metal. Without Connellsville coke, there was no American steel industry. It was that simple and that irreplaceable. By the 1860s, the region was being opened up by small operators, men who leased land from the large property holders, built beehive coke ovens, hired immigrant labor from Central Europe, and sold their product to the growing Pittsburgh iron furnaces to the north. It was a fragmented, competitive, chaotic industry. Nobody controlled it. Prices swung violently. Quality was inconsistent. The men who built and operated the ovens lived in company towns that their employers owned entirely. The houses, the stores, the churches, even the roads. What most people don't know about this world is how total the control already was before Frick arrived. The company town was not an invention of Frick's. It was the inherited architecture of the American industrial frontier, a system in which the employer was simultaneously landlord, grocer, priest, and law enforcement. Workers were paid in scrip, a private currency redeemable only at the company store, at prices the company set. If you quit, you lost your house. If you organized, you lost your job and your house simultaneously. The system was designed with elegant efficiency to make resistance structurally impossible. Into this world, in December 1849, was born a boy in West Overton, Pennsylvania, who would perfect that system into something that the men who designed it had never imagined possible. Henry Clay Frick was not born poor. His family was comfortable. His grandfather, Abraham Overholt, was a prosperous whiskey distiller whose brand, Old Overholt, is still on the market today. But comfort in 1850s rural Pennsylvania was a narrow thing. The whiskey money provided stability, not wealth, and Frick grew up acutely conscious of the distance between what he had and what the truly rich possessed. That consciousness drove him in ways that are visible, in retrospect, in every decision he made from adolescence onward. He was not interested in being comfortable. He was not interested in being respected. He was interested in being dominant, in controlling systems rather than operating within them, in owning resources rather than deploying them on someone else's behalf. By the time he was 20, he had identified the Connellsville coke business as the instrument of that dominance, and by the time he was 30, he had achieved something that professional economists of the era considered theoretically impossible: a single individual, operating with borrowed capital and astonishing organizational ruthlessness, had consolidated control over the majority of production in an entire major industrial sector. But to understand how, and at what human cost, we need to go back to a Pennsylvania farm in the 1860s, where a boy who smelled of whiskey distilleries and coal dust was already calculating how to turn everything around him into leverage. West Overton, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, 1865. The air smelled of fermenting grain and wood smoke, and the low hills around the Overholt farm were already beginning to be pocked with the shallow pits and rough timber structures of men prospecting for coal. Henry Clay Frick was 15, working in his grandfather's distillery and reading everything he could find about the business structures of the emerging American industrial economy. He was not a warm child. Teachers and relatives who knew him in these years consistently described someone who was watchful, precise, and startlingly uninterested in the social dimensions of boyhood. The games, the friendships, the communal pleasures that most children treat as the primary business of growing up. What interested Frick was numbers, specifically the relationship between capital, control, and return. He left school at 16 and went to work as a bookkeeper, first for a retail store, then for his grandfather's distillery business. The bookkeeping was almost certainly deliberate. He was not interested in bookkeeping as a career. He was interested in it as intelligence gathering, as a way of learning how capital moved, where the margins were, and where the leverage points in a business system were located. What he learned from those ledgers confirmed what the landscape around him was already suggesting. The Connellsville coking coal business was fragmented to the point of dysfunction. There were dozens of small operators, none controlling more than a handful of ovens, most perpetually undercapitalized, all of them selling into a market where prices swung so violently that a profitable month could be followed by a catastrophic one. The men who owned the land the coal sat under, the great landholding families of southwestern Pennsylvania, were collecting modest royalties while the operators above them scrambled for survival. Here's what's interesting. Frick identified the solution to this fragmentation when he was barely 20 years old. The problem was not the technology, the geology, or the labor supply. The problem was capital structure. What the Connellsville coke business needed was someone with enough money to buy out the small operators, consolidate their production capacity under unified management, and then control prices by controlling supply. It was, in essence, the Rockefeller playbook, and Rockefeller had not yet fully deployed it in oil when Frick was already applying it to coke. The obstacle was obvious. Frick had no capital. He was a 20-year-old bookkeeper from a whiskey family with a good brain and no balance sheet. What he had instead was something that, in the Gilded Age, could substitute for capital in the early stages of an ambitious enterprise: the ability to persuade bankers that his analysis was correct and that his execution could be trusted. In 1871, at the age of 21, Frick approached the Pittsburgh banking firm of T. Mellon & Sons, the institution controlled by Judge Thomas Mellon, patriarch of the Mellon banking dynasty, and made his case. He wanted to borrow $10,000 to begin buying up coke ovens and the leases attached to them. His collateral was minimal. His track record was non-existent. What he had was a detailed written analysis of the Connellsville market, a specific acquisition plan, and a presentation manner that Judge Mellon's son James later described as the most quietly confident business reasoning I have heard from a man of any age. The Mellons lent him the money. It was the beginning of a relationship between Frick and the Mellon family that would, over the following decades, make both parties extraordinarily wealthy and shape the financial architecture of American industrial capitalism in ways that are still visible today. Frick moved fast. He used the initial Mellon loan to acquire his first coke ovens, then leveraged those assets to borrow more and acquire more. By 1873, just 2 years after his first bank visit, he controlled 50 coke ovens and had established H.C. Frick and Company is a recognizable entity in the regional market. By 1877, the number was over 1,000 ovens. By 1880, he controlled approximately 80% of Connellsville coke production. Think about what that means. At the age of 30, Frick had achieved a monopoly, not a dominant market position, not a majority stake, but an actual functional monopoly over the fuel supply of the American steel industry. Carnegie Steel, Bethlehem Steel, and every other major iron and steel producer in Pennsylvania depended on coke that Frick either produced directly or could withhold. The Panic of 1873 was instrumental in this consolidation. The financial crisis that followed the collapse of J. Cook and Company sent credit markets into paralysis and drove dozens of undercapitalized coke operators into bankruptcy. Frick, who had cultivated his melon banking relationships with unusual care and maintained enough cash reserves to survive the credit drought, moved through the wreckage of the 1873 collapse like a man shopping at a distressed goods sale. He bought failed operations at cents on the dollar, added them to his network, and emerged from the Depression years with a market position that the preceding boom years could not have given him. I mean, the timing was not luck. Frick had structured his finances in anticipation of exactly this kind of market disruption. The lesson he had absorbed from his bookkeeping years, that fragmented, undercapitalized industries were structurally vulnerable to consolidation during downturns, was being applied with a precision that stunned his competitors and impressed his bankers. The human cost of this consolidation was, from the beginning, a matter of deliberate indifference. The workers in Frick's coke ovens, overwhelmingly recent immigrants from Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and Italy, many of whom spoke no English and had arrived in Pennsylvania with essentially no assets, lived in company towns that Frick controlled with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to his balance sheets. The houses were Frick's. The stores were Frick's. The scrip that substituted for wages was Frick's private currency, redeemable only at Frick's prices. Working conditions in the beehive ovens were, by modern standards, indistinguishable from certain definitions of torture. The ovens operated at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Workers pulled newly baked coke from the burning chambers with long-handled rakes, working in heat that caused permanent damage to eyes, lungs, and skin after years of exposure. The workday was 12 hours, 6 or 7 days a week. Safety equipment, in the modern sense, did not exist. Accidents were frequent, compensation non-existent, and the standard response to a serious injury was replacement. But here's the thing. Frick did not invent these conditions. He inherited them from the pre-existing structure of the Connellsville coke trade, and then, crucially, prevented them from improving. As consolidation gave him market power, that power could theoretically have been used to standardize wages upward, improve conditions, and reduce the catastrophic accident rate. Frick chose, consistently and explicitly, not to use it that way. His operational philosophy was simple. Labor was a cost to be minimized, and the way to minimize it was to maintain constant downward pressure on wages while preventing any organizational mechanism, union, committee, arbitration board, through which workers could collectively resist. By 1880, he was 30 years old, worth approximately $1 million, roughly $30 million in today's terms, and had already crushed 3 separate attempts to organize his workforce. The 4th attempt, and the most serious, was still 12 years away, but the methods Frick would use to meet it were already fully formed in his mind. Andrew Carnegie had been watching Henry Clay Frick for several years before he made his approach. Carnegie was, in 1880, already the most powerful man in the American steel industry, a Scottish immigrant's son who had climbed from telegraph messenger boy to steel magnate with a combination of genuine intelligence, ferocious ambition, and an ability to identify and acquire talented subordinates that bordered on the predatory. What Carnegie saw in Frick was something he needed and could not himself provide: operational ruthlessness. Carnegie was not a squeamish man, but he maintained with some care a public persona as a philanthropic progressive, a man who believed in labor's dignity even as his business practices systematically undermined it. He wrote essays about the gospel of wealth. He funded libraries. He gave speeches about the responsibilities of capital. Frick gave no speeches. Frick had no interest in public persona management. Frick believed, with a consistency that was almost philosophically pure, that the purpose of a business was to generate returns for its owners, that labor was an input cost like any other, and that sentiment had no place in the management of industrial operations. He was, in the language of a later era, the perfect operator for a CEO who wanted results without fingerprints. The initial connection was commercial. Carnegie Steel needed Connellsville coke. Frick's company produced it. The two men began negotiating supply agreements in the late 1870s, and those negotiations brought them into regular contact. Carnegie, whose judgment of character was one of his genuine gifts, recognized almost immediately that Frick's organizational abilities extended far beyond coke production. In 1881, Carnegie made his first formal move. He acquired a significant minority stake in H.C. Frick and Company, an investment that gave Frick access to Carnegie's much larger capital base, while giving Carnegie a stake in the fuel supply that his steel operations required. The arrangement worked well enough that by 1882, Carnegie had increased his stake to 11%. By 1883, it was 33%. By 1889, Carnegie had acquired enough of Frick's company to offer, and Frick had become senior enough within Carnegie's orbit to accept the position that would make both men historic figures. On January 1st, 1889, Henry Clay Frick became the chairman of Carnegie Steel. He was 39 years old. He was now in operational control of the largest steel manufacturing enterprise in the world, a complex of mills, furnaces, and processing facilities concentrated primarily around Pittsburgh and the Mon Valley, employing approximately 25,000 workers and producing roughly 25% of all American steel output. What's interesting is that Carnegie's decision to put Frick in the chairman's role was not universally welcomed within the Carnegie organization. Several senior managers who had worked with Carnegie for years were alarmed, not by Frick's competence, that was undeniable, but by his manner of exercising it. One Carnegie associate, writing to a colleague in early 1889, described Frick as a man who seems genuinely indifferent to whether the people around him live or die, so long as the production numbers are satisfactory. That was not hyperbole. It was, as subsequent events would demonstrate, an accurate operational description. Frick moved immediately to centralize authority. The Carnegie Steel operation had been managed, in the years before his arrival, through a relatively decentralized structure. Individual mill superintendents had significant operational autonomy. Labor relations were handled at the mill level, and wage agreements were negotiated plant by plant. Frick changed all of that. He imposed unified management, standardized production metrics, and, most consequentially, a corporate-level approach to labor relations that removed the individual superintendent's ability to negotiate with workers on any substantive issue. The logic was clear. Decentralized labor negotiations created variation. Some mills might have slightly better wages or conditions than others, which in turn created organizing pressure. As workers in worse conditions, mills pointed to the better-treated mills as evidence that improvement was possible. By centralizing, Frick eliminated that variation. Every mill had the same wages, the same conditions, and the same response to any worker who raised objections: replacement. Consider this. Between 1889 and 1892, Carnegie Steel's productivity increased by approximately 40%. Wages, measured in real terms against the increased productivity, declined. The share of revenues flowing to labor costs fell from roughly 22% to roughly 17%. The difference, the approximately 5% of revenues extracted from labor's share of productivity gains, flowed directly to profits, and thus to Carnegie and his partners, of whom Frick was now among the most senior. Carnegie, watching from a comfortable distance, he spent increasing amounts of time at his Scottish castle Skibo during this period, was delighted. The numbers were extraordinary. Frick was delivering what Carnegie had hired him to deliver. But the numbers had a timeline. Because the labor agreements that governed Carnegie Steel's most important facility, the Homestead Works 30 miles upstream from Pittsburgh on the Monongahela River, were due to expire on July 1, 1892, and at Homestead, the workers were organized. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the most powerful trade union in the American metal industries, had a contract at Homestead that provided its members with wage scales, working conditions protections, and grievance procedures that Frick regarded as intolerable interference with management prerogatives. He had been planning for the contract expiration for months, not planning to negotiate, planning to eliminate. What Frick had in mind for Homestead was not a labor dispute. It was a military operation, organized with the same systematic thoroughness he had applied to his Connellsville acquisitions 20 years earlier. In the spring of 1892, while publicly claiming to be engaged in good faith negotiations with the Amalgamated, Frick was simultaneously constructing a 15-foot fence topped with barbed wire around the entire Homestead Works perimeter, installing searchlights and rifle ports along its length, and entering into a contract with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency for the provision of 300 armed men who would be delivered to Homestead in the early hours of July 6 to retake the plant from any workers who had occupied it. The fence around Homestead was not subtle. Workers watching it go up called it Fort Frick. The press picked up the name. Frick did not care. He had never much minded what people called him. He cared about outcomes. The outcome he was planning for Homestead was the permanent destruction of the Amalgamated Association's presence in Carnegie Steel, and beyond that, the demonstration to the entire American steel industry that organized labor could be beaten decisively and permanently by any employer willing to absorb the short-term costs of a direct confrontation. Carnegie, at Skibo, exchanged cables with Frick throughout the spring of 1892. The historical record of those cables is incomplete. Carnegie was careful in later years about what he allowed to survive, but what remains makes clear that Carnegie was fully informed of Frick's strategy and had approved it. His subsequent attempts to distance himself from what happened at Homestead were, as the historian Les Standiford has observed, the most carefully constructed piece of self-serving revisionism in Gilded Age American history. By late June 1892, Fort Frick was complete. The Pinkerton contract was signed. The workers at Homestead, watching the fence go up and reading the newspapers, understood exactly what was coming. And on June 2009, when Frick formally broke off negotiations and announced the lockout, the 3,800 workers of the Homestead Works took control of the plant and prepared to defend it. The Monongahela River, at 4 a.m. on July 6, 1892, was still and dark. Two barges moved upstream through the pre-dawn quiet, towed by a river tug, carrying 300 Pinkerton agents armed with Winchester rifles and dressed in the agency's distinctive dark blue uniforms. They were supposed to arrive before dawn, secure the Homestead Works waterfront, and present the locked-out workers with a fait accompli. Armed men inside the fence, plant secured, reopening imminent. The plan failed before the barges reached the dock. Someone, accounts differ as to who, had spotted the tug and its barges hours earlier. By the time the Pinkertons attempted to land, the Homestead riverbank was packed with several thousand workers, their wives and their children. Some were armed. All of them understood, with a clarity that no management communication had bothered to provide, what the arrival of 300 armed men meant for their jobs, their wages, and the union they had built over the preceding decade. The first shots were fired at approximately 4:30 a.m. By the time the sun came up over the Monongahela Hills, the Battle of Homestead was already one of the most significant labor confrontations in American history. The Pinkertons, pinned down on their barges and unable to land against the massed resistance on the bank, were taking fire from multiple directions. Workers had positioned themselves on the high ground above the river, in the mill buildings and along the bank itself. Several attempts to rush the landing barge were driven back by concentrated gunfire. Here's what's important to understand about what was happening on the Homestead riverbank. This was not a mob. It was a coordinated defense of a community. The Amalgamated Association had, in the days since the lockout, organized the workers of Homestead into a quasi-military structure, rotating watch committees, communication networks, a system for distributing food and organizing medical care. The men and women on that riverbank had formed, in effect, a workers' government for the borough of Homestead, and they were defending it with the full knowledge that what was at stake was not merely their wages, but their entire way of life. The battle lasted 14 hours. 9 workers were killed, 7 Pinkertons died. Dozens on both sides were seriously wounded. The Pinkertons, having been unable to land and having exhausted both their ammunition and their nerve, finally surrendered, waving white flags from the barge decks and walking onto the Homestead riverbank under promise of safe passage. They did not receive safe passage. The workers, and particularly the women of Homestead, who had been standing on that riverbank for 14 hours watching their husbands, brothers, and sons take fire from men they regarded as mercenaries hired by a company that already owned their homes and their wages, were not in a mood for formal protocols. The Pinkertons were beaten as they walked through the crowd. Several were seriously injured. The scene of 300 armed men in uniform being driven through a gauntlet of furious steelworkers and their families was photographed by the press photographers who had arrived in Homestead in the early morning hours. And those photographs circulated across the country within days. Frick's response to the battle was immediate and predictable. He wired Carnegie with a brief summary. Our property was not taken and the men showed they could be driven off. We shall now go ahead and fill the works with non-union men. He issued a public statement declaring that Carnegie Steel would not negotiate with the Amalgamated under any circumstances, and he contacted the governor of Pennsylvania, Robert Patterson, to request the deployment of the state militia to Homestead. Patterson, under enormous political pressure from both the labor movement and the Carnegie business interests, deployed 8,500 National Guard troops to Homestead on July 12. With the militia holding the perimeter, Frick began hiring replacement workers, scabs in the language of the labor movement, and gradually restarting production. The Amalgamated, unable to maintain the siege against armed state force, began to fracture. Some members returned to work on Frick's terms, others held out. By November, the strike was effectively over. You see, the military dimensions of Homestead were dramatic, but the more important story was what happened in the weeks and months that followed. As Frick systematically dismantled not just the Amalgamated's presence at Homestead, but the union's ability to function in the steel industry as a whole, he fired every union member who had participated in the strike. He blacklisted them, not just from Carnegie operations, but through informal networks with other steel producers, from the industry entirely. He hired replacement workers at wages significantly below the pre-strike scale, working them under conditions that the union agreements had previously prevented. The legal consequences were, by the standards of the era, essentially non-existent. Strike leaders were charged with murder and aggravated riot. The charges were eventually dismissed for lack of evidence. The Pinkertons faced no prosecution. Frick faced no personal legal consequences whatsoever. What happened 2 weeks later was, by any measure, the most dramatic personal event in Frick's life, and, paradoxically, the event that most effectively neutralized the political consequences of Homestead for him and Carnegie. On July 23, 1892, a 21-year-old Russian-born anarchist named Alexander Berkman walked into Frick's Pittsburgh office, drew a revolver, and shot him twice, once in the neck, once in the shoulder. When Frick fell, Berkman drew a steel file that he had sharpened into a blade and stabbed him 3 times. A 4th stab was prevented by office staff who had finally subdued the attacker. The room was chaotic. Frick's partner, John Leishman, had been grazed by one of the bullets. Berkman was pinned to the floor. Frick, bleeding heavily from the neck wound, refused to be moved. He sat up in his chair, and while doctors administered first aid, dictated a statement to a secretary. He wrote several business letters requiring his signature. He met with a local minister who had arrived to offer comfort and discussed the status of the plant's reopening. He was eventually transported to his home at around 7 p.m., where surgeons removed the bullets under local anesthetic. Berkman had no connection to the Homestead workers. He had acted independently, motivated by anarchist principles rather than union direction. The Amalgamated Association immediately and explicitly disavowed the attack, but the disavowal barely mattered. The image of Frick, shot, stabbed, and refusing to yield, transformed him, in the eyes of middle-class American newspaper readers, from the ruthless operator of Fort Frick into something more complicated. A man of almost supernatural physical courage, a target of radical violence, a representative of order against chaos. The attack, in other words, gave Frick and Carnegie something they desperately needed in the weeks after Homestead, a narrative shift. The story was no longer about the Battle of Homestead and the 9 dead workers on the Monongahela bank. It was about the assassination attempt on a prominent industrialist by a foreign-born anarchist. The political sympathy that had been flowing toward the locked-out workers evaporated, not entirely, but enough. Congress, which had been considering investigations into the Carnegie Steel labor practices, quietly dropped the matter. By the end of 1892, The Amalgamated Association had been effectively destroyed as a force in the steel industry. It would not recover meaningful organizational presence in American steel for more than 40 years, not until the passage of the Wagner Act in 1935 and the organizing drives of the Congress of Industrial Organizations gave labor the legal framework it had lacked in 1892. Frick had achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. The cost, in lives, in suffering, in the long-term degradation of wages and conditions for steelworkers across the entire American industry, was a matter he recorded in no document and expressed in no interview. He had done what he believed needed doing. The numbers would follow. The decade after Homestead was, by any financial measurement, the most productive period in the history of Carnegie Steel, with the Amalgamated eliminated and the workforce operating under conditions that management dictated without meaningful resistance. The efficiency gains that Frick had promised Carnegie materialized with a consistency that made Carnegie Steel the most profitable industrial enterprise in America. Understand the scale. Between 1892 and 1900, Carnegie Steel's annual profits grew from approximately $4 million to over $40 million, a tenfold increase in 8 years. The company's output grew from roughly 322,000 tons of steel per year to well over 3 million tons. The Homestead Works alone, after Frick's restructuring, was producing steel at costs that no European competitor could approach. The key to these numbers was vertical integration, the business strategy that Frick and Carnegie pursued with systematic aggression throughout the 1890s. Vertical integration meant controlling every stage of the production process. The ore mines that produced the raw material, the railroads and boats that transported it, the coke ovens that converted coal into fuel, the blast furnaces that converted ore into iron, and the steel mills that converted iron into finished product. At each stage, the margin that would otherwise flow to an independent supplier flowed instead to Carnegie Steel. Frick's coke empire was the anchor of this system. H.C. Frick and Company, now substantially owned by Carnegie, controlled the fuel supply. The Oliver Iron Mining Company, acquired by Carnegie in the early 1890s, controlled enormous iron ore deposits in Minnesota's Mesabi Range. Carnegie's own railroad and lake shipping operations controlled the transportation network between the ore fields and the Pittsburgh mills. The result was a cost structure so low that Carnegie Steel could sell finished steel at prices that drove competitors out of entire market segments and still generate margins that produced the extraordinary profit figures above. It was, in the precise economic sense, a demonstration of monopoly power, not a legal monopoly, but the functional equivalent, a cost advantage so large that competition was, for practical purposes, impossible. What's interesting is the human arithmetic beneath these aggregate numbers. The gains in productivity between 1892 and 1900 were achieved primarily by two mechanisms: longer working hours and faster production speeds. The 12-hour shift, which had been a contested issue under the union contracts, became universal after Homestead. The pace of work at the furnaces and rolling mills was accelerated to the limits of what the machinery and the workers operating it could sustain. Accident rates at Carnegie Steel plants were, throughout the 1890s, extraordinarily high by any comparative standard. A study by the Pittsburgh Survey, a comprehensive social investigation of Pittsburgh conducted in the early 1900s, found that Carnegie Steel's Allegheny County operations were experiencing approximately 1 fatal accident per 1,000 workers per year, and non-fatal injuries at a rate that implied the average steelworker could expect a serious injury every 4 to 5 years of continuous employment. For context, the accident rate at comparable British steel operations during the same period was roughly 1/3 of the Carnegie figure. These accidents were not random. They were, in significant part, the direct consequence of the pace and hour conditions that Frick's management structure had imposed. Fatigue-related accidents, the category that encompasses most industrial injuries, are exponentially more common in the 14th hour of a 12-hour shift than in the 4th. Men working 7 days a week for months at a time in extreme heat with machinery operating faster than pre-Homestead norms were the input that produced Carnegie Steel's extraordinary profit margins. Frick knew this. The accident reports crossed his desk. He regarded them as operational costs, acceptable in the context of the production targets that the business required. There is no surviving evidence that he expressed personal distress about any of them. The relationship between Frick and Carnegie during this period was extraordinarily productive, and beneath its surface deeply unstable. They were, as personalities, almost perfectly opposed. Carnegie, the gregarious public performer, the philanthropist in waiting, the man who needed to be liked and admired. Frick, the private operator, the man who needed to win and who regarded the admiration of strangers as a matter of complete indifference. Carnegie needed Frick to do the things Carnegie could not be seen doing. Frick needed Carnegie's capital and his market position. The partnership worked because both men understood, with unusual clarity, what the other provided and what the other could not. But it carried the seeds of its own dissolution, because the things Frick did on Carnegie's behalf were things that Carnegie, as his public reputation grew and his philanthropic ambitions expanded, would eventually need to deny. The break, when it came, was not about labor or about Homestead. It was about money. Specifically, about the terms under which minority shareholders in the Carnegie partnership could sell their interests back to the majority. In 1899, a dispute over the ironclad agreement, the partnership document that governed the buyout of departing partners, escalated into a full legal confrontation. Carnegie sued Frick. Frick countersued. The dispute, which exposed the internal financial arrangements of Carnegie Steel to public scrutiny for the first time, was eventually settled through a restructuring that left Carnegie in clear control, and Frick with a buyout payment that his lawyers argued, publicly and loudly, significantly undervalued his interest. Frick's response to the settlement was characteristically blunt. When Carnegie reportedly offered to resolve the dispute with a personal meeting, Frick's reply, preserved in multiple contemporary accounts, was, "Tell him I'll see him in hell, where we are both going." The following year, 1901, Carnegie sold his entire steel operation to J.P. Morgan's newly formed United States Steel Corporation for approximately $480 million, the largest industrial transaction in American history to that point. Frick, as a significant partner, received approximately $60 million in U.S. steel bonds. It was an enormous sum. It was also, by Frick's own subsequent calculations, substantially less than his interest would have been worth under a fair valuation of what he had actually contributed to building. He invested the proceeds, diversified aggressively into railroads, real estate, and financial instruments, and by 1910 had rebuilt his fortune to a figure that modern historians estimated between $50 and $100 million, equivalent to roughly 1.5 to 3 billion in today's money. He would spend the final 2 decades of his life deploying that fortune in a direction that nobody who knew his industrial career could quite have predicted. The company town system that Frick perfected in the Connellsville Coke region between 1871 and 1892 was not, in its basic structure, his invention. As noted earlier, company towns had existed in American industrial communities since the early 19th century, particularly in the textile mill districts of New England. What Frick contributed was not the concept, but the engineering, the systematic, precisely calibrated application of total economic control as a labor management tool. Understanding this system in detail matters, because its consequences extended far beyond Frick's own enterprises and far beyond his lifetime. The company town model that Frick refined became the template for industrial labor control across the American coal and steel industries for decades after his death. Understanding what it actually consisted of is essential to understanding why the American labor movement fought so desperately to destroy it, and why at Homestead, the workers considered armed resistance preferable to continued submission. The physical geography of a Frick company town was, to begin with, designed as a control mechanism. Housing was constructed in clusters around the coke oven batteries, close enough that workers could be at their stations within minutes of a shift whistle, far enough from any independent town or road that reaching an alternative employer required a journey that a man working 12-hour shifts 7 days a week could not easily make. The houses themselves were built to a standard that provided basic shelter while ensuring that workers had no equity stake in their accommodation. They were rentals, deducted from wages before the worker received his pay envelope. The company store, officially called the truck store in the 1870s and 1880s, after the British truck system from which it descended, was the financial centerpiece of the control architecture. Workers in many Frick operations were paid entirely or partially in scrip, a privately issued currency that bore the H.C. Frick & Company name and was redeemable only at designated company stores. The store prices were set by the company, typically at 10 to 20% above the prices at independent merchants in the nearest towns. The effect was a hidden tax on every purchase. Workers were paid in dollars that were worth, in practice, 80 to 90 cents when spent at the only store available to them. Look at what this meant arithmetically. If a worker's nominal wage was, say, $1.50 per day, a typical figure in the Connellsville Coke region in the 1880s, and if 40% of that wage was consumed by company store purchasers at a 15% premium over market prices, the actual real wage, after the hidden discount, was closer to $1.40. Over a year of work, that difference compounded. A worker who nominally earned $450 annually was actually receiving the purchasing power of approximately $420. The difference, aggregated across thousands of workers and dozens of years, was a very large number that flowed upward to the company accounts. But the truck system was only one layer. The second layer was the eviction mechanism. Because workers lived in company housing, any employment termination, whether for cause, for participation in union activity, or for any other reason the company chose, resulted in immediate loss of housing. A fired worker did not merely lose his income. He lost his home, and if he had a family, the homes of his wife and children simultaneously. The eviction notice and the termination notice arrived together. The truth was that this mechanism transformed every individual act of labor organizing into an existential risk. The worker who attended a union meeting or signed a petition about wages or spoke to a labor organizer was not merely risking his job. He was risking homelessness for his family, typically in a region where the company town's geographical isolation meant there was no alternative housing within practical reach. The third layer was surveillance. Frick employed a network of informants, sometimes fellow workers recruited with small payments or promises of preferential treatment, sometimes supervisors specifically instructed to monitor and report, whose function was to identify organizational activity before it could reach the critical mass required for a strike. Workers identified as union sympathizers were let go quietly before they could build the relationships and organizational infrastructure that a serious labor campaign required. The turnover rate in Frick's coke operations was high. This was partly the natural mobility of immigrant labor, but partly the deliberate removal of any worker who showed signs of solidarity building. The fourth and final layer was the Pinkerton relationship. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was by the 1880s the largest private security organization in the United States, with more agents than the standing United States Army. Its services were available to any employer who could pay: strike-breaking, intelligence gathering, infiltrating labor organizations, and, when necessary, armed confrontation. Frick had retained Pinkerton services in the Connellsville region from the early 1870s onward. The 300 agents sent to Homestead in 1892 were not an emergency measure. They were an escalation of an existing relationship. Here's what's interesting about the ethical dimensions of this system. Contemporary critics, and there were many, including several within the Republican Party that Frick financially supported, argued that the company town system violated basic principles of free labor that were supposed to distinguish the American wage system from the slavery that the Civil War had recently abolished. The philosopher John Dewey, writing in the 1890s, described the Connellsville coke towns as a form of industrial feudalism inconsistent with the democratic premises of American society. The economist Richard Ely used even stronger language, calling the truck system a mechanism of exploitation indistinguishable in its effects from debt bondage. His position, stated publicly on several occasions, was that the company town system was an efficient solution to a genuine logistical problem. How do you house, feed and service a large workforce in a region without pre-existing urban infrastructure? The company built the houses because nobody else would. The company operated the stores because there was no market for independent merchants in these locations. The workers, he argued, were free to leave at any time, and he was technically correct. They could leave. They simply could not, in practical terms, leave without losing everything they had. The distinction between technical freedom and practical constraint was one that Frick made no effort to examine. It was, in this respect, consistent with his broader intellectual posture, a man who dealt in operational realities and had no interest in the philosophical structures that connected those realities to broader human questions. What ended the company town system in the Connellsville region was not Frick's conscience or even external legal pressure. It was, ultimately, the growing political power of the labor movement in the early 20th century, a political power that Homestead had paradoxically helped build by demonstrating, so dramatically, what workers were willing to sacrifice to resist. The West Virginia and Colorado coal mine wars of the early 1900s and 1910s, culminating in the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, when Colorado National Guard troops machine-gunned a tent colony of striking miners and their families, were direct descendants of the organizational and resistance culture that Frick's system had forced into existence. You cannot fully understand the American labor movement of the 20th century, the New Deal legislation, the Wagner Act, the rise of the CIO, without understanding what it was reacting against. And what it was reacting against had been, in its most complete and systematic form, the creation of Henry Clay Frick. In 1905, Henry Clay Frick began acquiring art. This is not strictly accurate. He had been buying paintings since the 1880s, and his Pittsburgh house had contained a modest collection for years. But 1905 marks the beginning of a systematic, seriously resourced, intellectually rigorous campaign to assemble one of the great private art collections in the world. Over the following 15 years, Frick would spend approximately $50 million, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion in today's terms, on old master paintings, Renaissance bronzes, medieval enamels, French furniture, and decorative arts that now form the core of one of the most distinguished permanent collections in the United States. The Frick Collection, housed in the mansion he built at 1 East 70th Street in Manhattan and opened to the public after his death in accordance with his will, contains works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Holbein, El Greco, Velázquez, Titian, Turner, Constable, and Fragonard, among dozens of others. Art historians rank it among the finest small permanent collections anywhere in the world, distinguished not just by the quality of individual works, but by the coherence of the collection as a whole. The juxtaposition, the man who deployed Pinkerton agents against steelworkers on the Monongahela, spending his retirement years arranging Vermeers in a Fifth Avenue mansion, is the central paradox of Frick's biography, and it has generated more commentary than almost any other aspect of his life. The art critic Robert Hughes, reviewing the Frick collection in the 1990s, described it as one of the most morally complex cultural objects in America, a monument to aesthetic perfection built with money extracted from human suffering. What most people miss is that Frick did not regard these two aspects of his life as contradictory. He had a coherent, if morally impoverished, worldview in which the function of capital was to generate wealth. The function of wealth was to enable civilization, and the function of civilization was to produce things of permanent value: art, architecture, scholarship, the refinements of taste that distinguished a society that had transcended mere material need. That this worldview required ignoring the workers who had generated the capital it rested on was not, to Frick, a contradiction. It was simply a matter of different categories. His approach to collecting was as systematic and competitive as his approach to coke consolidation. He engaged the leading art dealers of the era, particularly Knoedler and Company in New York, and the legendary Joseph Duveen, who had made a career of selling European masterpieces to American industrial fortunes. With the same analytical rigor he applied to business negotiations, he studied the market, identified undervalued works, negotiated with a patience and a willingness to walk away that dealers found simultaneously admirable and infuriating. Duveen, who sold Frick more than any other single dealer, described him as the most difficult client I have ever had, not because he was unreasonable, but because he was never wrong about price. This was not entirely true. Frick paid over market value for several works that Duveen persuaded him were rarer than the market had recognized, but the general characterization is consistent with what we know of his negotiating manner. The Fifth Avenue mansion itself, designed by Thomas Hastings of the firm Carrere and Hastings, built between 1913 and 1914 on the former site of the Lenox Library, was conceived from the outset as a public institution as well as a private residence. Frick's instructions to Hastings were explicit. The building should be designed to function as a museum after his death, with galleries capable of housing his collection in appropriate conditions and accessible to the public. The gardens, the proportions of the rooms, the relationship between interior and exterior. All of it was planned with the permanent collection in mind. Carnegie, meanwhile, was pursuing an almost identical late-life project in a different direction. Carnegie had spent the final decades of his life giving his fortune away, building libraries, endowing universities, funding the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and constructing an elaborate public identity as the philanthropist sage of the Gilded Age. By the time of his death in 1919, he had given away approximately $350 million. The contrast between the two men's approaches to legacy management is illuminating. Carnegie gave money away publicly, loudly, and in ways that required the recipients to display his name. The Carnegie Libraries, funded by grants that required the receiving municipality to name the building Carnegie Library and commit to ongoing operational funding, are a monument to a philanthropic ego as much as to genuine generosity. Carnegie needed to be remembered as a good man, and he organized his giving accordingly. Frick collected privately, displayed his collection initially to invited guests only, and left it to the public in his will, without attaching his name to any specific condition of access or display beyond the basic institutional structure. The Frick collection is named after him because the building he built is his building, not because he demanded the naming as a condition of the bequest. This distinction is, from one angle, more genuinely generous than Carnegie's conditional library program. From another angle, it is simply the behavior of a man who never needed external validation, even in death. The question of what the art collection represents in moral terms has no clean answer. The Frick collection is genuinely one of the world's great cultural resources. The Vermeers alone, 3 of the roughly 36 surviving authentic Vermeers in existence, gathered in one place, represent a cultural treasure of extraordinary value that has educated, moved, and enriched millions of visitors since the museum opened in 1935. The fact that the money that bought them came from the system that killed workers on the Monongahela does not diminish the aesthetic value of the works. It does, however, attach to them a history that cannot be cleanly separated from what they are. Artists, as a category, did not refuse to have their work acquired by Frick. Art dealers, as a category, did not refuse to sell to him. The cultural establishment of Frick's era, the curators, the critics, the collectors, regarded his collecting as evidence of refined taste and treated his mansion as a center of cultural life. This tells us something important about the degree to which the sources of Gilded Age wealth were regarded, by those who benefited from that wealth's cultural deployment, as a matter properly separate from the cultural objects it purchased. That separation is, of course, exactly the separation that Frick himself insisted upon. The coke ovens and the Vermeers existed in different categories of his mind. The suffering and the beauty did not, for him, speak to each other. Whether we are comfortable accepting the same separation when we stand in front of the paintings, that is a question the collection poses to every visitor, and that no curator has yet managed to definitively answer. Henry Clay Frick died on December 2, 1919. He was 70 years old. The cause was cardiac failure, though the physical deterioration of his final year suggested a man whose body had been using itself hard for a long time. He died in the Manhattan mansion on East 70th Street, surrounded by the paintings he had spent 15 years assembling, with a staff of approximately 30 people maintaining the house, and a personal fortune estimated at somewhere between $50 and $150 million, depending on the valuation method applied to the real estate and securities that composed the bulk of his estate. Carnegie had died 4 months earlier, in August 1919, at his summer retreat in Lenox, Massachusetts. The two men, who had not spoken since their legal confrontation in 1900, died within the same year, the last of the great Pittsburgh steel partnership that had defined an era. Carnegie left the bulk of his remaining fortune to charitable foundations. Frick left the Fifth Avenue mansion and its contents to the public, along with an endowment to maintain it, and divided the remainder of his estate among his family. The historical reputation of Frick, in the decades immediately following his death, was, to put it mildly, uncharitable. The labor press had spent 40 years documenting and denouncing his methods. Homestead remained a live memory for the tens of thousands of Pittsburgh area steelworkers who had lived through its aftermath, and the generation of depressed wages and destroyed union rights that followed it. The socialist and progressive movements of the early 20th century treated Frick as the paradigm case of Gilded Age labor exploitation, the most explicit and least apologetic embodiment of the system they were organizing against. What's interesting is that Frick's reputation in mainstream historical writing has been more complicated than this labor movement consensus suggests. Business historians of the mid-20th century, writing in an era when labor relations had been substantially reformed by the New Deal and the Union movement, and when the Gilded Age felt safely distant, tended to evaluate Frick primarily in terms of his organizational and financial achievements. The consolidation of Connorsville Coke, the vertical integration of Carnegie Steel, the operational management that produced the extraordinary efficiency gains of the 1890s, these are genuine achievements by the standards of industrial organization, and they have been acknowledged as such by historians who are not necessarily sympathetic to Frick's methods. The more recent historiography has moved back toward a harsher assessment, partly because labor history has received more serious academic attention in the last 30 years, and partly because the long-term consequences of what happened at Homestead have become clearer with the passage of time. The destruction of the Amalgamated Association in 1892 did not merely reduce wages and worsen conditions at Carnegie Steel. It set the organizational development of American labor back by a generation. The steel industry remained effectively unorganized until the 1930s, 40 years after Homestead, during which time the conditions that Frick had imposed at Homestead remained, with some variation, the industry standard. Think about what 40 years of unorganized labor in the American steel industry means in human terms. 4 decades of 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. 4 decades of accident rates, 3 times higher than in comparable European industries. 4 decades of wages that did not keep pace with the extraordinary productivity gains that the workers' own labor was generating. The historian David Brody, whose work on American steelworkers remains the definitive account of the industry's labor history, estimated that the wage gap between what American steelworkers actually received between 1892 and 1936 and what they would have received under collective bargaining arrangements comparable to the pre-Homestead agreements represented, in aggregate, billions of dollars transferred from workers to shareholders. That transfer, from labor to capital, over 4 decades in the world's largest steel industry, is Frick's most consequential legacy. It is not commemorated on any plaque. It does not appear in the Frick Collection's educational materials. It is, in the way of the most important historical consequences, invisible precisely because it describes an absence. Wages not paid, hours not reduced, accidents not prevented, lives not fully lived. Alexander Berkman, who had shot Frick in 1892, served 14 years in a Pennsylvania state prison for the attack. He emerged in 1906 and resumed his political activities, eventually being deported to Russia in 1919 alongside his lifelong partner, Emma Goldman, in the Red Scare deportations of that year. He later fled the Soviet Union, disillusioned by Bolshevik authoritarianism, and died in France in 1936. His memoirs, Prison Memoirs of an Anarchist, published in 1912, include a section on the Frick shooting that is remarkable for its moral complexity. Berkman acknowledges that the attack was politically counterproductive, that it discredited the labor movement at precisely the moment when it needed public sympathy, while maintaining that Frick represented an evil so complete that the moral case for resistance was beyond question. Frick's own published reflections on Homestead were sparse. He gave relatively few interviews on the subject in his later years, and those he gave were consistent in their framing. He had done what the business required, the workers had been given fair terms and refused them, and the deployment of force had been necessary to protect property that the company had a legal right to protect. He expressed no regret. He acknowledged no moral dimension to the question beyond the legal one. In this, at least, he was consistent from beginning to end. The one recorded occasion on which Frick came close to something like reflection on the human dimensions of his career was in a conversation with the financier James Stillman, reported in Stillman's memoirs. Frick, near the end of his life, allegedly said, "I have never been able to understand why the men I employed did not understand that I was operating within the rules of the system as it existed." The remark is either a genuine expression of incomprehension, the statement of a man who truly could not see past the formal legal structure of employment contracts to the human beings inside them, or a performance of that incomprehension as self-protection. The distinction, at this distance, is impossible to determine. The town of Homestead, Pennsylvania, Today is a study in what American deindustrialization looks like after a century has finished with it. The steel mills are gone. The last Homestead Works furnace was shut down in 1986, and the site is now occupied by a shopping complex called the Waterfront, anchored by a Target and a Costco, whose parking lot sits approximately where the Battle of July 6, 1892 was fought. There is a small historical marker near the river. It describes the battle in the careful, balanced language of official historical commemoration, a significant event in the history of American labor relations. The 9 workers who died are named on the marker. The Pinkertons who died are not. The Frick Collection on East 70th Street in Manhattan received approximately 400,000 visitors per year before the COVID-19 pandemic, and has returned to similar numbers since. It is consistently ranked among the finest small museums in the world. The Vermeers, Officer and Laughing Girl, Girl Interrupted at Her Music, and Mistress and Maid draw visitors from every country. The Rembrandt self-portrait in the Living Hall is considered one of the finest in existence. The El Greco St. Jerome and the Velázquez Philip IV of Spain represent the Spanish Golden Age at a level that no private collection outside Spain can match. The combination, the shopping mall on the Monongahela and the Vermeers on Fifth Avenue, captures something essential about Frick's legacy that neither location taken alone communicates. The destruction was real. Both are his. The modern labor movement traces one of its central organizational strategies, the industrial union, organizing workers by industry rather than by craft, directly to the failure of the craft-based amalgamated association at Homestead. The AFL-CIO's founding logic, the CIO's industrial organizing drives of the 1930s, the United Steelworkers of America's eventual establishment of collective bargaining in the American steel industry. All of it is a response, organized over 40 years, to what Frick demonstrated was possible when an employer controlled enough of an industry to simply absorb the cost of a strike and replace the workers. The Wagner Act of 1935, which guaranteed workers the right to organize and required employers to bargain in good faith, was, in a meaningful historical sense, the legislative response to Homestead. It represented the political determination, arrived at 4 decades late, that the state would no longer permit the kind of total employer control that Frick had demonstrated was achievable without legal constraint. The regulatory framework of American labor law was built, brick by brick, in reaction to specific abuses that Frick had either pioneered or perfected. What about the broader question of Frick's place in the history of American capitalism? Here, the assessment is genuinely mixed, and the mixing is not mere politeness. The organizational innovations that Frick applied to both the Connellsville coke industry and Carnegie Steel, vertical integration, economies of scale, systematic cost reduction through consolidated management, are genuine contributions to the development of the modern industrial enterprise. The American steel industry that emerged from the Carnegie-Frick era was, by international standards, the most efficient and productive in the world, and that efficiency had real consequences for American economic development, for the quality and cost of industrial products, and for the country's capacity to mobilize industrial resources in 2 world wars. The question is whether those achievements required the specific human costs at which they were obtained, and here the honest answer is probably not entirely. The productivity gains of the 1890s were real and significant, but the evidence from comparable industries in Britain and Germany, where labor organization was tolerated at earlier stages of industrialization, and where the 12-hour shift was abandoned a decade before American Steel finally abandoned it in 1923, suggests that similar productivity levels were achievable with less extreme labor suppression. Frick chose the most aggressive available option, not because it was economically necessary, but because it was consistent with his philosophical conviction that labor's interests were legitimately subordinate to capital's requirements. When you step back and look at the full picture, what Frick represents is something more specific than mere Gilded Age excess. He represents the end point of a specific argument, the argument that the employer's property rights are, in an industrial context, absolute, that the relationship between employer and worker is purely contractual, and that any mechanism by which workers collectively modify that relationship is an illegitimate interference with the market. He pursued that argument to its logical conclusion with a consistency and a physical courage that were, in their way, remarkable. And in doing so, he forced American society to confront the argument directly, at the cost of blood, on a Pennsylvania riverbank, and eventually to reject it. The rejection took 40 years. The consequences of those 40 years, in wages foregone, in injuries sustained, in lives shortened, are incalculable. But they are also, in a dark and uncomfortable sense, part of the architecture of the modern American labor settlement, the product of a confrontation that Frick forced and that American workers and American society eventually resolved against him. So the question remains, how do we hold in a single assessment a man who built one of the world's great art collections and one of the most brutal labor control systems in American industrial history? The paintings did not redeem the coke ovens. The coke ovens do not diminish the paintings. Both are real. Both are his. And the distance between them, the vertical distance as it were, from a beehive oven in the Connellsville Hills to a Vermeer on Fifth Avenue, is exactly the distance that American capitalism traveled in the Gilded Age and is still in some ways traveling today. So we've seen how a whiskey distiller's grandson from western Pennsylvania turned a fragmented coal business into a monopoly, partnered with the most powerful industrialist in America, crushed the most significant labor confrontation of the 19th century, survived an assassination attempt with a composure that defied human nature, and spent his final decades arranging Rembrandts in a Fifth Avenue mansion built with money that had never, not for a single day, been innocent. Today, the Frick Collection continues to operate as one of America's finest museums, its endowment growing, its galleries recently expanded after a careful renovation that maintained the intimate domestic scale Frick intended. The museum's educational programs explicitly address the history of how the collection was funded, a candor about the institution's origins that is more unusual in American cultural life than it ought to be. And that reflects a genuine seriousness about historical accountability. The Homestead Works site's transformation into a shopping complex is in its way a more complete comment on Frick's legacy than any museum interpretation could provide. The thing that happened there, the battle, the deaths, the 40-year suppression of steel industry unionism that followed, has been paved over with the infrastructure of consumer capitalism. The workers who died on that riverbank have a small marker and a handful of scholarly histories. The company they were fighting has dissolved into a series of mergers and bankruptcies whose end products bear no relationship to anything Henry Clay Frick would recognize. Modern relevance is not difficult to find. The questions that Homestead posed about the relationship between property rights and human rights, about the legitimate use of private force in labor disputes, about the degree to which employers can use economic leverage to prevent workers from organizing collectively, have never been fully resolved. They appear in different forms in every significant labor confrontation of the modern era, in the Amazon warehouse organizing drives of the 2020s, in the debates about gig economy worker classification, in the ongoing arguments about union rights in states that have passed right-to-work legislation. The specific mechanisms have changed. The underlying argument has not. The balanced reflection that Frick's story demands is genuinely difficult, because the two sides of his legacy are so far from each other in moral register. There is the art, real, beautiful, publicly accessible, representing one of the most sophisticated private aesthetic achievements of the Gilded Age. And there is the system, the company towns, the truck stores, the Pinkertons, the broken union, the 40 years of 12-hour shifts and suppressed wages that followed Homestead. Both are real. Neither cancels the other. The real lesson here isn't that Frick was a uniquely evil man. It's that the system he operated was designed to concentrate power in ways that made extreme outcomes not merely possible, but under competitive pressure, nearly inevitable. Frick did not need to be a monster to do monstrous things. He needed to be a man who accepted the system's logic completely, who had no internal mechanism for weighing the human costs of that logic against its financial rewards, and who possessed the organizational ability to execute the system's implications at a scale and with a consistency that made him its definitive exemplar. Whether we like it or not, American labor law, the entire legal and regulatory framework that protects the right of workers to organize, to bargain collectively, to refuse unsafe working conditions, was built, statute by statute, precisely as a response to what men like Frick demonstrated was possible in the absence of such protections. The Wagner Act is, in a meaningful sense, Homestead's most important long-term consequence. The worker who today cannot be fired for joining a union owes that protection in part to the workers who were fired, beaten, and killed on the Monongahela Bank in 1892. So the question remains, when we stand in the Frick collection, in that extraordinary room where Rembrandt and Vermeer and Holbein share walls in a light that Frick chose and a space that Frick designed, what exactly are we looking at? Art, certainly. History, inevitably. And perhaps a question that American society has been avoiding since 1892, whether beauty built on suffering is redeemed by its own excellence, or whether the suffering remains permanently in the walls. If you made it this far, through the Connellsville coke ovens, the Battle of Homestead, the Assassination attempt, and the Vermeers, leave a comment with the word Homestead. That's how we know you stayed for the full story, not just the highlights. If this kind of documentary depth history is what brings you here, the stories behind the stories, the human and financial detail that most history classes leave out, then subscribing is the most useful thing you can do. We publish this level of research every 2 weeks, and the back catalog covers everything from the founding of Standard Oil to the collapse of the Soviet industrial economy. If you want to go deeper on the Gilded Age industrial story, our documentary on J.P. Morgan, the banker who bought Carnegie Steel, reorganized American railroads, and personally stopped a national financial panic with his own credit, is the natural continuation of this one. Everything that happened after Frick and Carnegie sold to Morgan connects directly to what we've covered today. That video is linked on screen and in the description. Thank you for watching. The history is worth your time. We'll see you in the next one.